Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our read-along of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice for Jane Austen, July 2024. Netherfield Hall has been let at last, and Jane Bennet, the oldest and prettiest of the Bennet sisters, has taken a horse and gone over at the invitation of two of the sisters of the new owner of Netherfield Hall, two of the Bingley girls. It's 3 miles. So she, of course, didn't want to walk, and during her ride, she's caught in a sudden hard rainstorm, and it makes her sick. It's not actually how infections work, but that's okay. She gets to Netherfield Hall and falls deathly ill with a bad cold. This is a source of mild alarm to her father, but not to her mother. Mrs. Bennet has been hoping for some reason for Jane to stay at Netherfield Hall at least overnight, if not a little longer, because the longer she's at Netherfield Hall, the longer she's in the intimate company of Mr. Bingley, the new owner of Netherfield Hall, who is smitten with her and who is wealthy. She's smitten with him as well. There's really not much in the way of the stereotypical Regency mama throwing her girl at a wealthy young man in order to catch him in the parson's mousetrap. There's really none of that. From the instant that they meet, Bingley and Jane are fond of each other. Jane sends back word that word is sent back to Longbourn, the home of the Bennet family, that Jane is too ill to travel. She's too ill to come back. And Elizabeth, Jane's sister, wants to go and see to her, is worried about her, doesn't want to just wait for word from Netherfield that she's either doing well or doing worse. So she walks to Netherfield Hall, over field and stream, jumping over stiles, getting muddy, and arriving flushed with the exertion of exercise in order to see to her sister, who is worse than we were originally led to believe. Jane is pretty sick. Elizabeth barely leaves her room, and is at first impressed that the Bingley girls, who struck her as fairly supercilious, do seem concerned for their house guest. And Bingley, of course, Mr. Bingley obviously seems concerned, and so does Mr. Darcy, Bingley's imperious and standoffish friend, who is down at Netherfield along with the whole Bingley party. And that's where we pick up. We are at chapter 8. At 5 o'clock, the two ladies retired to dress, that is, Jane and Elizabeth. And at 6:30, Elizabeth was summoned to dinner. To the civil inquiries which then poured in, and amongst which she had the pleasure of distinguishing the much superior solicitude of Mr. Bingley's, she could not make a very favourable answer. Jane was by no means better. The sisters, on hearing this, repeated 3 or 4 times how much they were grieved, how shocking it was to have a bad cold, and how excessively they disliked being ill themselves. Then thought no more of the matter, and their indifference toward Jane, when not immediately before them, restored Elizabeth the enjoyment of all her original dislike. Their brother, indeed, was the only one of the party whom she could regard with any complacency. His anxiety for Jane was evident, and his attentions to herself most pleasing, and they prevented her from feeling herself so much an intruder as she believed she was considered by the others. She had very little notice from any but him. Miss Bingley was engrossed by Mr. Darcy, her sister scarcely less so, and as for Mr. Hurst, by whom Elizabeth sat, at dinner, that is, he was an indolent man who lived only to eat, drink, and play at cards, and when he found her prefer a plain dish to a ragout, he had nothing to say to her. All he talked about is the food, and she doesn't care about the food. When dinner was over, she returned directly to Jane, and Miss Bingley began to abuse her as soon as she was out of the room. Her manners were pronounced to be very bad indeed, a mixture of pride and impertinence. She had no conversation, no style, no taste, no beauty. Mrs. Hurst thought the same, and added, "She has nothing, in short, to recommend her, but being an excellent walker. I shall never forget her appearance this morning. She really looked almost wild." "She did indeed, Louisa. I could hardly keep my countenance. Very nonsensical to come at all. Why must she be scampering about the country because her sister has a cold? Her hair was so untidy, so blousy. Yes, and her petticoat. I hope you saw her petticoat, 6 inches deep in mud. I'm absolutely certain. And the gown which had been let down to hide it, not doing its office." "Your picture may be very exact, Louisa," said Bingley, "but this was all lost upon me. I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked remarkably well when she came into the room this morning. Her dirty petticoat quite escaped my notice." "You observed it, Mr. Darcy, I am sure," said Miss Bingley, "and I am inclined to think that you would not wish to see your sister make such an exhibition." "Certainly not." "To walk 3 miles, or 4 miles, or 5 miles, or whatever it is, above her ankles in dirt, and alone? Quite alone? What could she mean by it? It seems to me to show an abominable sort of conceit and independence, a most country town indifference to decorum." "It shows an affection for her sister that is very pleasing," said Bingley. "I am afraid, Mr. Darcy," observed Miss Bingley in half a whisper, "that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes." "Not at all," he replied. "They were brightened by the exercise." A short pause followed this speech, and Mrs. Hurst began again. "I have an excessive regard for Jane Bennet. She is really a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart to see her well settled. But with such a father and mother, and such low connections, I am afraid there is no chance of it." "I think I have heard you say that their uncle is an attorney in Meryton?" "Yes, and they have another who lives somewhere near Cheapside." "That is capital," added her sister, and they both laughed heartily. "Oh, this isn't going well. We don't like these people." "If they had uncles enough to fill all Cheapside," cried Bingley, "it would not make them one jot less agreeable." "But it must very materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world," replied Darcy. To this speech Bingley made no answer. Very seldom disagrees with his friend. But his sisters gave it their hearty assent, and indulged their mirth for some time at the expense of their dear friend's vulgar relations. With a renewal of tenderness, however, they repaired to her room on leaving the dining parlour, and sat with her till summoned to coffee. She was still very poorly, and Elizabeth would not quit her at all till late in the evening, when she had the comfort of seeing her sleep, and when it appeared to her rather right than pleasant that she should go down the stairs herself. On entering the drawing-room, she found the whole party at loo. That's card games. That's not at the bathroom. That's at card games. It was immediately invited to join them, but suspecting they were playing high, she declined it. In other words, for high stakes. She doesn't have any money, didn't bring any money. And making her sister the excuse, said she would amuse herself for a short time, that she could stay below with a book. Mrs. Hurst looked at her with astonishment. "Do you prefer reading to cards?" said he. That is rather singular." "Miss Eliza Bennet," said Miss Bingley, "despises cards. She is a great reader, and has no pleasure in anything else." "I deserve neither such praise nor such censure," cried Elizabeth. "I am not a great reader, and I have pleasure in many things." "In nursing your sister I am sure you have pleasure," said Bingley, "and I hope it will soon be increased by seeing her quite well." Elizabeth thanked him from her heart, and then walked toward the table where a few books were lying. He immediately offered to fetch her others, all that his library afforded. "And I wish my collection were larger for your benefit and for my own credit. But I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than ever I look into." So Bingley has assembled a wealthy man's library. It was once a sign of distinction. And he's apparently brought that library in wooden crates to Netherfield Hall. But he's not much of a reader himself. Elizabeth assured him that she could suit herself perfectly with those in the room. "I am astonished," said Miss Bingley, "that my father should have left so small a collection of books. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy." Another mention of Darcy's home, Pemberley. "It ought to be good," he replied. "It has been the work of many generations." "And then you have added so much to it yourself. You are always buying books." Are they meaning to mock him? Are they meaning to mockingly push him towards Elizabeth, who has said that she's going to read in company? I don't think the readers of this book are considering this to be mockery, since they all buy more books than they should. I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these. Neglect? I am sure you neglect nothing that can add to the beauties of that noble place. Charles, when you build your house, I wish it may be half as delightful as Pemberley. Look, in this chapter you'll see that we're getting first names. We're getting given names here. Lots of them. We now know Bingley's first name. We now know his sister, or we're going to know both his sister's full names. And what the point being made here is that Bingley is only leasing Netherfield Hall. He doesn't actually have a hall of his own. He doesn't have, as we saw in an earlier chapter, he doesn't have an estate of his own. I wish it may, is what his reply was. But I would really advise you to make your purchase in that neighborhood, and take Pemberley for a kind of model. There is not a finer county in England than Derbyshire. With all my heart, I will buy Pemberley itself, if Darcy will sell it. I am talking of possibilities, Charles. Upon my word, Caroline, I should think it more possible to get Pemberley by purchase than by imitation. Elizabeth was so much caught up by what passed as to leave her very little attention for her book, and soon laying it wholly aside, she drew near the card table and stationed herself between Mr. Bingley and his eldest sister to observe the game. I don't know about the rest of you, but at this point I want nothing more than to know what books were on that table, and what book did Elizabeth pick up. Is Miss Darcy much grown since spring? Said Miss Bingley. Will she be as tall as I am? I think she will. She is now about Miss Elizabeth Bennet's height, or rather taller. How I long to see her again. I never met anybody who delighted me so much. Such a countenance, such manners, and so extremely accomplished for her age. Her performance on the pianoforte is exquisite. It is amazing to me, said Bingley, how young ladies can have patience to be so very accomplished as they all are. All young ladies accomplished? My dear Charles, what do you mean? Yes, all of them, I think. They all paint tables, cover screens, and knit purses. I scarcely know anyone who cannot do all this, and I'm sure I never heard a young lady spoken of for the first time without being informed that she was also very accomplished. Your list of the common extent of accomplishments, said Darcy, has too much truth. The word is applied to many a woman who deserves it no otherwise than by knitting a purse or covering a screen. But I am very far from agreeing with you in your estimation of ladies in general. I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen, in a whole range of my acquaintance, that are really accomplished. We don't know if Bingley is being sarcastic here. Just a little bit sarcastic, in his gentle way. No, nor I am sure, said Miss Bingley. Then, observed Elizabeth, you must comprehend a great deal in your idea of an accomplished woman. Yes, I do comprehend a great deal in it. Oh, certainly, cried his faithful assistant. No one can be really esteemed accomplished who does not greatly surpass what is usually met with. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, dancing, drawing, and the modern languages to deserve the word, and besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved. Keep in mind, Miss Bingley doesn't have any of those things. she's seconding Darcy because she wants to put down Elizabeth, but she's not accomplished by her own definition at all. She's just a London nitwit. All this she must possess, added Darcy, and to add to all this she must yet add something more substantial, and in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder now that you knowing any. This is Elizabeth, of course, that voice. Are you so severe upon your own sex as to doubt the possibility of all this? I never saw such a woman. I never saw such a capacity of taste and application and elegance as you describe, united. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley both cried out against the injustice of her implied doubt, and were both protesting that they knew many women who answered this description, when Mr. Hurst called them to order, with bitter complaints of their inattention to what was going forward, in other words, the game. He wants them to get back to cards. He doesn't want enough of this talk. As all conversation was thereby at an end, Elizabeth soon afterwards left the room. But we don't leave the room. We stay. We got the gossip before she arrived, and now we get the gossip after she leaves. Eliza Bennet, said Miss Bingley when the door was closed on her, is one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own, and with many men, I dare say, it succeeds. But in my opinion, it is a paltry device, a very mean art. You would know. Undoubtedly, replied Darcy, to whom this remark was chiefly addressed. There is meanness in all the arts which ladies sometimes condescend to employ for captivation. Whatever bears affinity to cunning is despicable. She has just enough wit to know that this is not a safe ground for conversation. Miss Bingley was not entirely satisfied with his reply as to continue the subject. Elizabeth joined them again only to say that her sister was worse, and that she could not leave her. Bingley urged Mr. Jones be sent for immediately. That's the apothecary, the country doctor. While his sisters, convinced that no country advice could be of any service, recommended an express to town for one of the more eminent physicians. This she would not hear of, but she was not so unwilling to comply with their brother's proposal, and it was settled that Mr. Jones should be sent for early in the morning if Miss Bennet were not decidedly better. Bingley was quite uncomfortable. His sisters declared that they were miserable. They solaced their wretchedness, however, by duets after supper, while he could find no better relief to his feelings than by giving his housekeeper directions that every possible attention must be paid to the sick lady and her sister. So that is the chapter, and that was, I think we can all agree, fairly grim. These people are, as Mrs. Bennet might say, no better than they should be, with only a couple of exceptions. Darcy isn't quite drawn in. He's certainly not made to be mean or petty in the way that Bingley's sisters want him to be. They clearly want him to be. They are mean and petty. Mr. Hurst can be left out, but the sisters are irredeemable. We now know that their care and compassion for Jane when they're at her bedside is completely fake. A sham just to be good hostesses or just to smile at her behind their backs. We know what they think of her and what they say about her when neither sister is around. We might, it would be very unwise to do so, but we might say that some of this chapter is a bit of a misstep on Jane Austen's part. What is all that talk about what makes an accomplished woman? Why does it go on for so long? That would be, as I say, a mistake. It is a mistake to underestimate this author. I have heard this author underestimated even in my own lifetime. I have heard Pride and Prejudice referred to as, quote, a very simple book. That conversation is setting up the beau ideal, is setting up the perfect social vision, specifically so that we will measure it against Elizabeth. And maybe be right there in the trenches when minds are changed about what is an accomplished woman and what isn't. What are you valuing and what aren't you? It's worth remembering that other than Mr. Hurst, perhaps, all these people are very young. But the main plot import of the chapter is that Jane is pretty bad. She's pretty ill. So Elizabeth has to be there. There is no artifice involved here. There was no artifice in Jane being at Netherfield in the first place. The sisters invited her. Probably because they do genuinely like her company in some way or other. They can't stand the country place where they have been plunked down by joining Bingley at Netherfield. But they probably do like her. It seems impossible not to like Jane. There was no artifice involved in their inviting her, and there was no artifice involved in her being caught in the rain. Eventually, as we're told, her father told her he could not spare the carriage. Could not spare the horses for the carriage, so she had to go over on horseback anyway, and was caught in the rain, which, despite the sarcasm of the narrator, is not under Mrs. Bennet's control. So there's no artifice at all in Jane being there. She's not throwing herself at Bingley. And there's no artifice in Elizabeth being there. She genuinely cares for her sister, and it's made clear in this chapter, if it wasn't in the last one, that some genuine care is necessary. Jane is quite ill. So there's no calculation involved in Elizabeth being at Netherfield either, right under the nose of Mr. Darcy, as often as she can stay away from Jane, which I think draws a line underneath Darcy's ambiguous response to Miss Bingley, that captivation, any kind of cunning, is despicable. I think we can draw a line under that, because this is not a gambit on the part of the Bennet girls. But how is it going to happen? How is it going to turn out? They're at Netherfield Hall. Their mother is probably the only person who's happy about this. But we'll move on to the next chapter and find out. So I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.